Today is August 25th, 2023. I'm Don Wunsch, the Mary Finley, Missouri Professor of Computer Engineering and Director of the Cummer Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems, doing this interview for the Neural Networks Society History Committee. And I have a great pleasure of being at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences in the office of Terrence Sejnowski. Terry's a household name in the field of neural networks, founder of the NeurIPS conference, member of the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine and Engineering, Presidential Career Award recipient, and many other honors. And anyway, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here, Terry. Thank you for having me over and agreeing to do this interview. It's a real
thrill.
Sure,
absolutely. Yeah, it's been a journey going back to the 80s. It's such a great opportunity for us to sort of think about how we got here.
Yeah. And I first met you when I was a grad student, and you were already quite well established. You came to speak at Boeing in the late 80s, and we were also both at the first ICNN in 1987 here in San Diego. And there were several meetings in San Diego over that period of time. Within 5 or 6 years, maybe 3 or 4 meetings here in San Diego. And this is still where a lot of the action is. So,
we were talking earlier about Robert Heck Nielsen. Of course, he had one of the first neural network companies, and he was based here, UC San Diego, right across the street. I'm also on the faculty there, by the way. I have 2 hats. My lab's here at the Salk, but I teach over at UCSD, and I have an Institute for Neural Computation. But it wasn't just the meetings. The Parallel Distributed Processing Group, David Rumelhart,
mm-hmm.
Backprop fame. Jeff Hinton was a postdoc here. So I met Jeff for the first time at a meeting he organized in 1979 on models of associative memory with Jim Anderson. And we hit it off. And so this was part of my the youthful kind of energy, enthusiasm. It all started there.
You guys did some of you had already made some well-known contributions before then, but you guys did one of his first big hits in the restricted Boltzmann machine around that time.
Well, we were inspired. John Hopfield was my thesis advisor at Princeton, and he came up with the Hopfield network. And so I remember at a meeting we heard him talk, and Jeff and I got together. He was using Hopfield networks for local minima as the content addressable memory, and we were trying to find a network that could do global minima.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we came up with the idea of heating up the network,
mm-hmm.
and that's the Boltzmann machine, and then gradually cooling it, and that was simulated annealing, Scott Kirkpatrick. So putting these pieces together led to something we didn't expect, which was actually more important, as it turned out, than our original goal, the global minimum, was if you keep it at a constant temperature and let it come to equilibrium, things simplify, and you could there's a very simple learning algorithm for multi-layer networks of binary units. That's the Boltzmann machine learning algorithm. And that broke a logjam that had been in place for 30 years since the Perceptron book, mm-hmm. Claiming that you could never generalize the perceptron learning algorithm. And now, of course, with Backprop and the many other learning algorithms, we know that was completely wrong. There was a mental block somehow that the field had.
Yeah, and that's another great thing about the 87 conference. Marvin Minsky was there to tell his side of the story. Do you remember that? He gave a plenary.
I don't. I may have missed it. Tell me what his take was.
So he basically said, well, I was a fan of neural networks, and I worked in that area. And in the
It's true. He actually, his thesis, Ph.D. thesis in math was on neural networks. That's right.
Yeah, and so Uh, he disclaimed responsibility for being the Darth Vader of neural networks, but
I'll tell you. This is, he may have, but he was.
Yes. Yeah.
But no, but in a funny way, I think what happened was that he really was excited, and he's very smart, and put a lot of effort into it. He actually built things from components, resistors, capacitors. And of course, back then you couldn't make much progress that way. But I think since then, what I think happened was that he was the jilted lover.
Yeah.
Right? He fell in love with something, and it didn't reciprocate. So that leads to 2006, right? So the big Dartmouth conference on AI was in 1956. So this is the 50th anniversary. And there were, I think, 6 or 7 people who were there at that 2006 meeting who had been at the original, including Marvin. And there was a banquet afterwards, and there was literally the 6 people were at the high table, literally elevated above us. And at the end, each one had a few minutes to say something about it. Was, by the way, the purpose of it was to sort of 50th anniversary to both look back at the achievements and also look forward. Right, that was their that was our discussion, and we had a bunch of really fantastic talks by a lot of the leaders in the field. I gave a talk on TD learning and the TD Gammon. I had worked with Jerry Tesaro on using backprop, but he had the bright idea of using reinforcement learning, so playing at championship level. In any case, at the end of this banquet, after everybody had something to say, and it was actually a very nice festive meeting with a few hundred people, there were questions from the audience. So I put my hand up. And I said, Dr. Minsky, I have a question for you. I said, there are some people in the neural network field who consider you the devil. Are you the devil? and this is like, just it was clear that I pressed a button, and he just launched into this long diatribe, which was trying to explain how we're naive and didn't understand anything about scaling, and that we shouldn't take on problems like that. That was way beyond the. And he kept going for at least a minute or two, and then finally I stopped him. I said, Dr. Minsky, I asked you a binary question, yes or no. Are you the devil? And this stopped him in his tracks. And finally he sputtered and said, yes, I am the devil.
Well, much like Darth Vader, it's there are nuances.
I actually, I know I was being provocative, but in fact I had a lot of admiration for him, and his book with Papert was actually very, very high quality. It was math. It was really they took it all the way through, understanding the geometry of perceptrons, and that actually still is a very, very foundational book.
Yeah.
I think the problem though is that he had too much power in the field of AI, and it didn't leave a lot of room, for startups, so to speak, in AI, which is what Jeff and I were trying to do.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that I saw writing on the wall when I was there was starting to be a rebound. Around I finished my doctorate in '91. I got in the field in '85. But one thing that I noticed was that while we were having, I won't call it an AI winter, but like a neural network winter in the prior to '85 period, the Russians were funding cybernetics research, so I spent a good bit of time learning about what they'd been doing and recruiting some Russians into my group. So there was a lot of opportunity there. But as I mentioned to you, I got pulled in because of optical computing, and so the optical implementation of the Hopfield model but I was curious, what got you early interested in the field at the very earliest, when it was just a gleam in your eye? What kind of got you into it?
Oh, so my background is in physics, uh, theoretical physics at Princeton, and uh, I had been working with John Wheeler on black holes and gravitational waves, and had gotten disillusioned because there's no data.
Mm-hmm.
And I started taking courses in neuroscience and specifically Mark Konishi was there. He was working on barn owls and how they were able to catch prey in the dark, using sound localization. And Charlie Gross had a graduate course on vision. I learned about Hubel and Weasel. And I remember studying one long summer for the general exam. For general exam was not a single exam; it was a series of exams in a week-long exam, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, for every area of physics.
Wow.
So I started reading about early days of cybernetics, actually, that you mentioned. It was Hosea Macy conferences.
Mm-hmm.
And it was what was remarkable was that they actually transcribed the discussion.
Oh,
And
cool.
these were very, very sophisticated people. Norbert Wiener was there, Ralph Gerard, Margaret Mead. I mean, many different areas of not just the brain, and also culture, psychology, and so forth. And it was really exciting because they were talking about things that seemed like they were new approaches to thinking about how computing takes place in the brain. And I started thinking, my God, this is really exciting. In fact, it's maybe more exciting than the universe.
Yeah.
And the difference is you can do experiments with your own hands. You don't need to wait for a supernova or a satellite to go up and collect data. And so that's where I started talking to John Hopfield. It turned out that he had gotten interested in neuroscience. I was a graduate student, but he was going around to all these big meetings, the Neuroscience Research Program, for example, in Boston. And he would come back and we would just talk about all these fantastic things that were happening in neuroscience. And that really sent me off in the direction. Of course, I was a physicist, so what you do, you write down equations. So I wrote down nonlinear dynamical models of neural networks and started analyzing them. And that really got me started. Now, after publishing a few papers with that approach, I realized that, what if they're wrong? If the equations are wrong? In other words, I started looking more carefully into neurons and discovered they're much more complicated, of course. Yeah. And so after I got my Ph.D. for my work on neural network models, stochastic models, which actually is coming back today. People are still thinking about looking at noise in neural networks along similar lines. I took a summer course at Woods Hole on neurobiology, and it was a turning point in my life because 10 weeks, very intense experimental experience. I recorded my first neurons, action potentials. I did anatomy, electron microscopy, and actually the research I did was publishable, it turned out, from just a couple of weeks of work. Skate electroreceptor. These are electroreceptors that have microvolt sensitivity, right? Mm-hmm. And that I didn't turn back. I said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to understand how the brain works, and whatever it takes.
Great. Well, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, I know that you're still extremely active and working on new projects all the time. So, what are you excited about that you're obviously excited about your whole portfolio, but maybe if there's a couple of facets that you'd like to talk about that you're excited about right now.
In fact, I'm very excited right now about a, a, a this is actually several projects that we've worked on over the last 5 or 10 years, which are now coming together, converging in a way that is very, very satisfying. And this has to do with how information is represented in the cortex. Mm-hmm. And there's the story going back to Hubel Wiesel is that each neuron selectively responds to a feature, visual field, oriented edges and bars in primary visual cortex, and then it gets more complicated as you go up the hierarchy. But the problem with that perspective is that it's representing visual input coming in like a snapshot. Mm-hmm. Like a sequence of images, and that's of course how cameras work. Mm-hmm. That's not how brains work. Brains are asynchronous. Information is flowing up and down. It's not just feed forward. And it's always puzzled me what the dynamics adds to that. Mm-hmm. In other words, can we look at this as a dynamical system? And in 2015, working with a group at Mass General Hospital. This is studying epilepsy patients, recordings from epilepsy patients. These patients come in because they are unable to control it with drugs. And so they put in a grid of electrodes, very invasive. And then they record for 2 weeks. You have a ton of data in humans. And so we put a lot of effort into analyzing it, and here's the discovery we made, which was really remarkable. During sleep, there is a period during which something occurs they're called sleep spindles. They're global. Mm-hmm. They are about 10 to 14 hertz. They're bursts of activity in the thalamus and the cortex, reciprocally connected. They last for a few seconds, and they recur thousands of times during the night. So these sleep spindles were always a mystery to me, and I put a lot of effort into understanding them from the biophysical level. But now that we could look at them from a global level, from the grids of electrodes, 64 electrodes on the surface of a hemisphere, we discovered that they're not synchronous, they're traveling waves.
Oh yeah, you talked about this in a
right.
thing that's on YouTube. That talk we mentioned before about the
yes.
unreasonable effectiveness of deep learning.
Well, that was 2015, and that was a very for me exciting insight because in physics waves are how you transmit information, right? Sound waves, electromagnetic waves, gravitational waves.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? So I've been puzzled about that now for the last 10 years. And I think we finally understood it. I think we have a hypothesis that can explain it. Mm. But to explain it, I have to give you a tiny piece of the transformer. The transformer has transformed natural language processing.
Sure.
Chat GPT has just taken the world by storm in terms of public and scientists and companies. Unbelievable. Okay, this is an extension of what we were talking about earlier about the role of neurips in that process. But the part that I wanted to, it's very different from the brain, is the fact that, and this is, I think, one of the secret sauces of the transformer, is that they don't represent words one at a time, the way that you do when we're talking, as they come in. But rather, it's a huge vector. They have a big vector, the context length, how many words, has been going up. It's now something like 100,000. You can put a whole book into a transformer now. Mm-hmm. And that means that the transformer, when it's going through the loop, predicting the next word over and over and over again in response to your query, has access to a very long distance relationships between words in the sentence, between sentences, between chapters, paragraphs. Kind
of like the game of Go, where things happening a long ways away can have a major influence.
This is Go on steroids we're talking about, putting together the pieces on the board. Yeah, they interact. That's the key. Words interact with each other over a long distance. And so how does the brain do that? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, here is the hypothesis, and I'm writing a paper right now with former postdoc and with Pat Churchland. We're having a wonderful time. So here's our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that when an input comes in to the visual cortex, and this is very well established, by the way, we have a paper in Nature with John Reynolds here, monkey visual cortex. It's like throwing a pebble into the water, and you have traveling waves.
Mm-hmm.
So this is stimulus-induced traveling waves. The one I talked about earlier were during sleep.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that there are traveling waves in every frequency band.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking about alpha, which is 10 to 14, and then there's gamma, 30 to 80, and each of them has different spatial and temporal kind of footprints in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so but here's what could be happening is that when inputs are coming in asynchronously, they're causing ripples to proceed and interfere with each other, just like in the hologram.
Mm-hmm.
Interference fringes.
Uh-huh.
Those interference fringes have information not just about what's happening locally, but what's happened a short time ago somewhere else. And you can show mathematically that all the information can be extracted from a time window. In other words, the information has been re-represented in a completely new format.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a way that the brain could do something similar to what a transformer does.
Mm-hmm.
A transformer has access to words that are maybe separated by a long distance.
Mm-hmm.
And if the brain can do the same thing by using time as the extra dimension,
Mm-hmm.
that means it could have, when it is now in the hierarchy, what you're passing up is not just a snapshot, but a whole history.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go up, the history gets longer and longer and longer, so that by the time you get to the top of the hierarchy, you get to the hippocampus, you're dealing with a very, very long, maybe who knows how long, many minutes, experience over many minutes. Now that can be represented in this new way. So it makes a lot of predictions. There are all kinds of ways that we're now going through the literature and finding evidence for it. And if this is true, it's a link between modern AI, large language models, and human language.
That's powerful. And one thing of what you said that really resonates with me is you mentioned the holographic metaphor, because there have been people for a long time who've been thinking. Yeah, Carl Pribram, Peter Van Heerden's another one. There's
yes.
And by the way, Peter Van Heerden came to my dissertation defense.
Wow.
Yeah, he had moved to Seattle. He was retired.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so mine was the first implementation of art in optics. And it was part of it was a holographic model. Part of it was just a correlator, but part of it was a holographic model. And so Peter was excited about that.
Well, I mean, that was an idea whose time was to come. And I think the difference between the hologram, which is spatial, dimensions,
right.
which is recovering a three-dimensional object in space, right? It's all spatial. But what we think is happening in the brain is that it's both space and time. The time dimension is the critical one here.
Yeah.
And that goes way beyond holograms. But it's the same principle. It's exactly the same principle. And unfortunately, it's just as impenetrable as the hologram. In other words, you look at a hologram, what do you see? You just see a bunch of wavy lines, right? There's no way you can figure out what's in it.
Yeah.
But the information is there.
Right. You have to basically hit it with the right encoding, and you can get out what you want.
Exactly.
And that's fascinating. I like that a lot. Wow. I can see why you're excited about it. And so you have quite a network of collaborators that you work with in this topic.
Well, my whole career is based on trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, most scientists focus. They pick out one piece, they drill down,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that's how you make discoveries. You have to really focus. If you you know if you're too broad, you get diffuse.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've been able to do with working with collaborators, each one having a piece of the puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
is to collaborate with them, bring computational tools, analytic tools, to analyze their data,
Mm-hmm.
and to come up with some new insight that maybe they didn't have, or you know, could add another dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that at the level of, I just explained the global level, which is systems, but also I have a big part of my lab is focused on synapses, which are down, you know, at the more microscopic level.
Mm-hmm.
And there it's blossoming in the sense that we have insights now. Synapses are not just one number weight.
Mm-hmm.
Synapses have temporal dimensions. Just you know, time is the final frontier. You know that.
Yeah, yeah.
Regardless of what you've heard from Star Trek, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
And that now is going to be the next, I think, frontier in neural networks is putting in more time scales. So, you know, the two time scales that we focused on are first the learning time scale, plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
That's very slow, especially as the network is bigger and bigger. And the inference, the time it takes to actually give it an input and get an output, right? That's milliseconds in the brain. And so in between, there are timescales you know, in every part of the brain that are involved in working memory, for example, is important for holding on to information over what we discuss over minutes and hours. And there's everything in between.
Well, talking about temporal dynamics reminds me of, actually, it might have been the last time I was on the campus, was the Temporal Dynamics of Learning Science and Learning Center that you had
Yes.
with Gary Cottrell.
Right.
And so I was part of I think I could say it after about almost 20 years, part of the site review team. And it was fascinating. A lot of that was very new back then, but it's turned into something quite profound. And I've heard you mention some of this in your more recent talks, some of the aspects of time even down at the synapse level, and why it remains to be important, and some of the implications of the things you're looking into today.
Well, you know, thank you for mentioning that. One of the big passions of my life has been learning, obviously, but and not just technical in terms of mechanisms or even the psychology of learning. Those are all important. But you know, our educational system is in shambles.
Yeah.
And I wanted to help it. And so together with Gary, he was the PI, but I was a co-PI, and a bunch of other, by the way, it involved 12 institutions, 50 faculty, over 10 years, $37 million from the NSF, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were 6 of these centers. Ours was the only one that was focused on the brain and machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
And we had an incredibly productive decade in so many ways. And I'm not going to take up the time with this. For example, Javier Movellin put together a robot that he brought into a preschool, you know, for toddlers, and had the robot interact with the little kids running around, right? You know, and we learned an enormous amount. We thought we were going to help, you know, the teacher teach the students. No, it was the toddlers teaching us how to reach them. It was so much fun, and it was actually one of the things that came out. Many important scientific advances. We had almost no impact on the public. I mean, we worked actually here in a charter school on campus, the Preuss School. So we worked with a lot of small groups, you know, students, so forth, and so that was important. But it was very hard to go from there to the U.S. because there are like 12,000 school districts, and so you have to knock on 12,000 doors, and so we're not prepared for that. We're not a company.
Yeah.
But we found a way to get around all the different groups, you know, the school districts, the the principals, the teachers. Massive open online courses.
Yeah.
So Barbara Oakley and I, she's an engineering professor at Oakland University in Michigan, it put together, like, we're talking now about like 2012 or 13, a MOOC about learning how to learn.
Mm-hmm.
This MOOC has become widely popular, unbelievable. We're talking here about, it's like 3.5 million people now have taken the course online, free, in over 200 countries, ages 10 to 90.
Wow.
And I get fan mail from them every day.
Wow.
From people saying it really has changed their lives, that, if they had known this earlier when they were younger, it could have been so much, school would have been so much better for them because they had trouble with learning. And we just basically used basic principles. It wasn't, we're not, this is not anything that they couldn't have found in the literature.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did is made it accessible to the public. And we used all sorts of media techniques like green screen to make it not just accessible, but attract their attention and get them to think about things. I was the science and neuroscience part of that pair, and she was a fantastic educator. She would explain, how to improve their ability to learn, and then I would tell them why that's how the brain does it.
and so if somebody Googles learning how to learn, they'll find this.
Oh, it's number one, learning how to learn, we have a book
I think
out,
I'm gonna look for that.
and it's actually led to a whole series of MOOCs. We have a new set of 3 MOOCs, a specialization, which is on common sense teaching for teachers. What we realized was, okay, 3.5 million, that's a drop in the bucket with billions of people out there. What we need is a multiplier. So the idea is to teach teachers these principles. Mm-hmm. And they can go and teach and have many, many students and many classes over the years. And so that's just taking off. That's very recent.
Oh, great. Great. Wow. So, in terms of, you started this journey as a student. You became an educator. How do you reflect on how that's played out in terms of the outflow of what has happened as a result of the students that you've interacted with?
Wow. Okay. I would not be where I am today and have accomplished as much as I have without having the most fantastic group of students over the last 30 years here at the Salk Institute. It's just a joy to have a student come with a lot of energy and enthusiasm, give them a problem to work on, and see how they approach it. Every student is different.
Yeah.
And I have students in my lab from almost every department from over at UCSD. We're talking about cognitive science, bioengineering, physics, math, even philosophy. And so each one brings a different perspective. And so that has really helped me to be able to see. I was talking about the pieces of the puzzle. It helped me to try to not just understand something about the brain and now artificial intelligence, neural networks, but how to put those pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happening right now. I just told you an example where it bridges between AI and the visual cortex, synapses, and it's an incredibly challenging problem, and it's incredible though that we now have the tools and techniques to actually make progress. So I was involved in putting together the plans for the Brain Initiative. So I was there literally at the very beginning, before it was an initiative, helping to get the Office of Science and Technology Policy to accept it. They had like a dozen different grand challenges, and any one of them would have been fantastic. Mm-hmm. But they chose, Barack Obama chose ours. They chose the brain. And so the NIH put together a group of 15 wise men, mm-hmm. to put together a $5 billion grant proposal. And so I was the computational guy. And we had, over a period of a year and a half, we had many, many meetings and disagreements and insights. I learned an enormous amount, by the way, because you get the chance to see what people really think. Mm-hmm. And we had consultants come in, 48 consultants, all the best neuroscientists, and give us advice. That brain initiative, that document, Brain 2025, has served as the template for NIH for the last 10 years. And it has far exceeded our expectations on what could be done. We, for example, had goals, milestones. And one of them was to record more neurons, right? So we figured that, look, right now, people are recording one or two at a time. There was some technology that was an array, a Utah array, which could do up to 100 electrodes. And we thought that we should scale this up to 100,000. You know what it's at now? 1 million.
Wow.
And it's because new technologies come on board, like optical recording. So you don't have to put an electrode in anymore. You can. I mean, there are advantages to doing that. But you could also, for example, record from every neuron in the brain of smaller creatures like zebrafish, larvae, mm-hmm. and also flies. We can record from 100,000 neurons in the fly simultaneously.
I think that's going to lead to really great things. I remember attending KDD 97. That might have even been here in San Diego. It was somewhere in California, either San Diego or LA. And people even then were talking about, we're modeling the human brain. And my engineering skepticism goes off the chart when I hear anybody say they're modeling the human brain. And I told them at the Q&A of one of the keynotes, I said, don't talk to me about the human brain. You can't even do the fly. And if you can record every neuron of the fly in vivo and watch how it's responding, that's going to be a big step of the puzzle.
And not only that, but now we have something which was an important part of that puzzle. Because, recording from the neurons doesn't really tell you how they're communicating with each other. If you want to model it, you have to know what the connectivity is. So, we now have the entire connectivity of the fly, of every neuron and how they're connected with each other. This is connectomics. It was just done recently over at Janelia Research Center over Howard Hughes Center over in Washington, D.C. And it's magical. Once you have the connectivity and the physiology, they just go together and they just reveal algorithms. You could peel off algorithms, like for the visual system, mm-hmm. like motion. It's all happening now. It's accelerated. In fact, that's really what happened with the Brain Initiative. What it did was, I would say, it accelerated advances in neuroscience by a factor of 10. Mm-hmm. In other words, they did in 10 years. The engineers, by the way, it's the engineers who actually made this happen. The NIH, we said you should not just give the money for more of the same, because the budget for neuroscience in NIH is much greater, much greater. Mm-hmm. But what we need is to get engineers to work together with neuroscientists. And if you don't do that, it's going to be slow going. And so, for the first 5 years, the only way you can get a grant from the Brain Initiative was you had to have 2 PIs, 1 neuroscientist, and 1 engineer. Mm-hmm. And you had to have a goal, which was to go beyond the existing techniques. And the IN in the acronym BRAIN is Innovative Neurotechnology. That was, and before this, NIH, it was very difficult for an engineer to get any money from NIH for understanding, for advancing the tools for understanding how the brain works. But this was so successful, and it really trained up a generation now of students, who were funded by this big project. They're now going into labs and helping accelerate the research that's going on there. And so I really think it's like jumping 100 years into the future.
Both of those are steep learning curves, and so when you get a set of people that are trained on both of those learning curves,
right.
and also not just the people who are trained on both, but also the people who are trained on one but learn a little bit about how to talk to each other, that has tremendous
that's what it takes. It takes the languages in engineering is so different from neuroscience. It's not that completely different, but the kind of training that people have and the way that the technical terms, jargon is different. It takes years and years and years to overcome that. In fact, that's what we accomplished at NeurIPS.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember those first few years, people would get up and give talks, and the mathematicians would put up equations, and of course the neuroscientists had no idea what that meant, and then the neuroscientists would go up and speak in all the gobbledygook that neuroscientists use for the globus pallidus and the striatum and so forth, and of course they didn't know what we were talking about. So this was it took years and years and years to come up with a common language that an umbrella that everyone could use to interact with each other, and it's paid off handsomely. I mean, this has really been driving this big convergence that's happening between AI and neuroscience. This is really an exciting time.
Yeah, and some of the things that might come out of something like that, of course, computationally, there's amazing things, and we see AI advancing in leaps and bounds. Also in human health. So you mentioned sleep spindles earlier, and in your YouTube on the unreasonable effectiveness of deep learning, you talk about the healing powers of sleep. So, for example, two main problems, Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury are areas where there's a lot of need for progress.
Oh, absolutely. Alzheimer's is a tough one because it's a case where neurons degenerate, and when that happens, we don't have any way now to repopulate. We will eventually, but with TBI, it's a different, I think, problem. TBI is a problem with the connections, the long distance connections between different parts of the cortex, the white matter. And that involves not just the neurons, but the glial cells, the oligodendrocytes that ensheath the axons that carry the information and speed up the spikes, mm-hmm. right? And that is from concussions, from blows to the head, and it's a communication problem. Mm-hmm. I think that we can make a lot of progress there because there's plasticity in that system. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is happening in many other ways. For example, mental disorders. Mm-hmm. It's taken us a long time to figure something out. People always thought that, well, it's psychological, right? It has nothing to do with the brain. It's not a biological problem. No, it's biology. It's all biology. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing they tried to do was to use drugs. Okay, so drugs are really crude. They go in, they just hit so many places in the brain. Side effects of these, drugs for schizophrenia, for example, or pick your favorite problem that people have, depression, are very, very inadequate, and the side effects are worse in some cases than the disease. Okay, but now there's a whole new field, and at the very highest level of NIH, NINDS, which is involved in NIMH. These are the two big neuroscience institutes.
Yeah,
and
neurological disease and stroke, and the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Strokes, and the other one is the National Institute
mental health.
of Mental Health.
Yeah, disease and stroke. So, computational psychiatry. Mm-hmm. So it's a computational problem. It's neural circuits go mm-hmm. wrong, and it can go wrong in many different ways. The synapses could be screwed up. Or it could be communication. I was just saying, for TBI, mm-hmm. Communication could be screwed up. many, many different ways to go wrong. And cancer, by the way, is very similar. It's not just one disease. There are dozens and dozens of different kinds of cancer. And, it took us a long time to figure that out. But now we're making progress with cancer. And that it'll take us a little bit more time and to figure out how to deal with all these different mental disorders and problems with stroke and so forth.
And that's bad news and good news. The good news is that you may find a silver bullet for one thing, and it doesn't affect everything else, but there may be a lot of silver bullets around that are not that hard to solve. And so that's happened with cancer.
It's happening with cancer, but it took 50 years.
Yeah.
You remember the war on cancer?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
the emperor of all maladies.
Well, that's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
And the good news is that we weren't making any progress except in chemotherapy, which was palliative, until we had the molecular tools for going into the cell, figuring out what the molecules are involved, what goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we discovered that cancer was a very heterogeneous disease, because different pathways can go wrong, and also gave us targets, drug targets, that can go into specific types of cancer and stop it. We now have a bunch of those, a handful. With immunotherapy, for example, Tony Hunter here was involved in developing a drug that is specific for lung disease. So this is now happening. With Alzheimer's, we're at the very beginning. That's to say, all of the trials, that have drug trials that have been aimed at Alzheimer's over the last, there's been 30 over the last 20 years, phase 3, billions and billions of dollars that we're talking about. They've all failed. Mm-hmm. The last few look promising, but they're palliative. It's the endpoint that they're going after. Alzheimer's starts decades before the symptoms, and unless you go after the cause, you're never going to be able to help people. And that's where we are today. We're just beginning to get the tools to go after and figuring out where does it begin, and try to prevent that from progressing. So, but it'll happen. Biology, the tools of biology now are as amazing, that we have the power to be able to add and subtract genes at will. We have stem cells. The therapy has come along, and that's been, but it takes time. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of people, and so it may take decades again for us to figure out how to do that for the brain.
Well, when you mention tools being at the beginning, there's one thing that I want to make sure to cover in this interview, and that is, we mentioned earlier the game of Go. And I want to go on record as saying you got there first in terms of applying reinforcement learning by self-play to the game of Go. When I encountered that topic, I got fascinated with the game of Go. And finally, in the mid-90s, when I had some students that I could assign to look at it, I dug and found, a few years before we started, you and one of your colleagues...
Peter Dayan.
Yeah. You wrote a paper on reinforcement
right.
learning by self-play in the game of Go, and I've always made sure to cite that work.
I
got there second. But you got there first. You applied reinforcement learning.
We did. It was in a smaller game board, but it was... Peter has had a spectacular career in reinforcement learning, and that was kind of the spark. I think that he appreciated that there was a lot of power here to eventually, and again, we could never have predicted back in it was the 90s when he and Tony Bell and Reed Montague, and I had this fantastic group of graduate students and postdocs back then in the 90s. It was the golden period in my lab. And we were just knocking problems off one at a time, but that was just a startup problem. In other words, we never pursued it. Now, of course, Peter, it sparked his career. So that's really what was happening in my lab, was that people were tackling really difficult problems and making some progress, and then going off and starting careers, and really making progress.
Well, we picked up that ball and ran with it, and we were the first to screen with self-play, and then Peter Baldi published that. I was the associate editor that approved his paper. I didn't make him cite me, but he wrote a very nice paper on that, and then those two things came together. I never dreamed that DeepMind would be acquired for $500 million by Google and that they would give them a blank check to run with that problem. I thought it would take a century, but that does go to show what the difference of an investment can make, because I think without that investment, it could have taken a century.
Oh, easily. So I think that what happened was that these high-tech companies had unbelievable resources, and they could go after the really big problems. And it's like not all of them were successful. So, I mean, like Waymo finally is apparently autonomous now in San Francisco. I just read that. That's a step forward. It took, in my book, by the way, 2018, A Deep Learning Revolution, I predicted that it would take decades. Everybody thought, oh, around the corner. No, you don't understand. Okay, that the technology was much more slowly, and it takes typically many decades to go from something that works in the lab, under controlled conditions, and something that actually is in the wild. That's a big jump, and so that's what's happened in the last 10 years. But the thing, go back to Go. I'll tell you that it was around that time when that book came out. I did a book tour in China. And the Chinese were just like, they were just vibrating.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Because this is their game. Right?
Yeah, right.
They invented it.
Right.
And they for them, it was the supreme human achievement. It was an art form. It was, their whole culture, they was like rock stars. Like, the public has these the football players and actors, and they have these Go players and people who are really good intellectually, and so what I realized was, I lived through the Sputnik. Do you remember the Sputnik?
Yeah.
That was a lightning bolt in the U.S. and suddenly we thought we were on top of the heap here, and suddenly there are these satellites going right over our heads.
Yeah.
And that created, again, had a huge impact on us, right? We invested an enormous amount in the going to the moon, man on the moon, Kennedy. And by the way, that is still paying off. $100 billion of investment back then into electronics, microprocessors, integrated circuits at that time, obviously satellites and rockets, materials, heat shield and Tang.
Yeah.
All of that has paid off handsomely by creating industries.
Yeah.
The whole satellite industry, right? The whole computer industry. That's why we're so far ahead, is that we made that investment.
And the same thing happened at Google. The money that they spent sounds massive, but their market cap went up in a few months after they defeated the human champion by far more than what they invested. And clearly the downstream, and in fact, one of the things that's most exciting in AI, you hear a lot about the recent advances in ChatGPT, but what they turned Go into with the protein folding problem, it's just phenomenal. The protein folding problem, it used to be you solve one protein and you get buckets dumped on you.
Okay, this is wonderful. This is wonderful because I'm just writing the last chapter of my new book on ChatGPT and the deep language revolution, right? And I make a parallel between, and everybody thinks those are two separate realms, okay? But let's just think about this, right? There's actually a lot of analogies between language, which is a string of words, and proteins, which are strings of amino acids. There's all sorts of analogies having to do with structure, of sentences, syntax, and the structure and the syntax of amino acids and proteins that gives them their function.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, deep learning has been effective in both domains.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I know why.
Why?
And the reason is that there's an infinite number of possible sequences of amino acids, all random and totally useless,
Mm-hmm.
except for a very small sliver of a subset of almost measure zero, which are the ones that nature picked out that actually have a function.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Go, or
Yeah.
if you look at language, okay, language is similarly. There's the old story about if you give a monkey a typewriter and have him do random keys, eventually you'll get Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the trouble with that is that everything else is crap, right? All the other things, and that's an infinite amount of random words. In fact, the probability of getting even words is small, and forget it. That's not going to work. It turns out that of all possible strings of letters, only a very, very tiny subset that have a certain structure, arranged in a certain order, have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what deep learning does, that's what people don't appreciate, is that it is like it can zero in on the structure from all that randomness and figure out what it is, where it is, and focus and extract that out from all the other stuff that is noise,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's
Match filter on steroids.
this is steroids that are so powerful that and here's a kind of a just thought of this as another analogy. It's like you got this mountain and there are streaks of gold in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is that 99.999% of it is rock and stuff that is not valuable.
Mm-hmm.
How do you extract the gold?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to find some way to identify where the gold is, and then to leach it out or something that is to separate it, right? And that's what these network models can do on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. And by the way, it's problem after problem after problem like this. This is not just, vision is another good example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, suppose that you have a megapixel,
Mm-hmm.
and so each pixel can have, let's say, 10 values of gray level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 10 to a million power different images.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost all more random, right? Just
Uh-huh.
snow.
Uh-huh.
But the ones that actually correspond to something that you would recognize, a subset of measure zero. So all these problems, these difficult problems, have this in common.
Uh-huh.
So it's being able to extract deep structure that separates the streaks of gold from the dross.
Uh-huh.
And once we had an architecture that could do that, it can make progress on not just one problem.
Mm-hmm.
The very same architecture can be used on all these problems. Now, of course, there are many different architectures, and they improve all the time. Transformers are just the latest. That will continue. We'll have this. This is the beginning. This is like a whole new world of computation that we just scratched the surface of.
Yeah. I can tell that the contagious enthusiasm is still there. Probably, definitely more than 3 decades since I first met you, and I still am infected by that contagious enthusiasm as much as the first time I heard you speak when you came to visit at Boeing. And I'm just thrilled to be here and to have the opportunity to get your perspective. Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share, particularly for people who are new to the field?
Well, so we're at a stage where the Wright brothers were back in 1903.
I agree.
Kitty Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many opportunities for young people coming in today. And the part that makes me the most excited, there are just so many different jobs. New jobs are being created.
All the time. Yeah.
Prompt engineers, right?
Yeah.
The latest that I came across. By the way, who are they hiring? They're not hiring engineers. They're hiring people from English Lit.
Yeah.
They're the ones who understand language and how to prompt a large language model. Okay, but there is going to be, I think, even within our lifetime of the students, a breakthrough equivalent to what happened at the beginning of the 20th century when physicists discovered general relativity, special and general relativity, and quantum mechanics that transformed the physical world. But what's going to happen now, we've just started with tools that are going to allow us to come up with tools that are going to transform the cognitive world that we live in.
Yeah, that's certainly true of biology in general, and the subset about cognitive science. I think it's absolutely true. The people think of the 1920s as the golden age of physics, maybe. The 2020s definitely has the likelihood to be golden age of biology in general and computational biology in particular.
Yes, it's happening, and that so wonderful to be here while with students and with you who have lived through this.
Yeah.
What a wonderful adventure it has been.
Yeah, it really has been fantastic, and the best is yet to come, and we're still raring to go and continue to participate in it with a lot of gusto. So.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was great
interview.
talking, Don.
Yeah.